Recently, we visited Fighter World at Williamtown in New South Wales. This is located in close proximity to the RAAF's Air Combat Group, and at the time of our arrival, we witnessed 16 F-35s and other aircraft operating from the base. Here's the Managing Director, Jack van der Linden, welcoming us to the museum.
Hello, welcome to the RAAF Williamtown Aviation Heritage Centre, more commonly called Fighter World. We've got 2 display hangars and we have 17 large aeroplane models within the environment over here. We've also got a couple of cockpits, one a Mirage cockpit and a Macchi cockpit, which people can climb into and see what it feels like being in either a Mirage or a Macchi. We've got simulation, we've got a Hornet VR simulator. It's very, very realistic.
We were very fortunate to have former test pilot Ron Haack guide us through the museum. Ron is also the manager of Wings magazine, the flagship publication for Australia's Air Force Association, and he knows his aircraft very well.
Well, welcome to Fighter World. As you've already heard, this is probably the best display of fighter collection in the world, in Australia particularly. So, and I happen to fly some of these aeroplanes, so I'll be happy to take you around and talk about the aeroplanes to you as we go. The first one here is the Windshield. It was designed in Australia, built in Australia. Windshield stands for Little Eagle, an Aboriginal word for Little Eagle, and it was the first aeroplane I flew in my life. I think I took a train to Melbourne to join the Air Force, and they put me in this thing. And in those days, that was 1970, we were just doing 15 hours or so in this aeroplane to assess our attribute to be a pilot. And from there we went to the Macchi, which is behind us here. But as a trainer, this aeroplane had some flying characteristics that were demanding. And I think from that point of view, in some respects it's good. It makes it harder to learn, perhaps, but actually once you've learnt on this aeroplane, you move to another aeroplane that doesn't have those same adverse characteristics. It's easier, and therefore you can feel very comfortable in a different aeroplane. I've got to introduce you to my favourite aeroplane, the Mirage 3. I flew it for 15 years, and it's like every new sports car you ever jump into. It's the first love of your life, so it was fantastic. A great machine, single pilot, although there was some 2-seaters that were used for training primarily. And what they did with the 2-seater, they took the radar away. The radar sits in the nose cone here, and moved a fuel tank behind the cockpit out, and that's where they put the second seat. So it didn't have the capability of the single-seat aeroplane. We got the aeroplane in 1963. It flew through till 1979, and I flew it from 1973 till 1979. I flew one of the last ones into Woomera as we disposed of the aeroplane. I should say I was probably one of the only person in Australia who flew this aeroplane as a civilian. I was flying it at the same time I was flying the F-18. You find you enjoy about some machinery is the challenge. This aeroplane was a challenge to fly precisely. It was a challenge to do the job we asked of it. We tried to make it a multi-role aeroplane, so we did anti-shipping work, we did air-to-surface work, we did air-to-air, both air combat and air defence, and there is a subtle difference there. It's probably a bit hard for the general public to understand the difference, but air defence is more airspace denial, whereas air combat is actually cleansing the airspace, if you can see the difference there. Yeah. So we did all those roles, and so running different weapons, having to understand each weapon system or each weapon you're employing, and knowing how to employ those weapons to most effect. In those days, we're coming out of the Cold War era or through the Cold War era, and we used to think that we had to evade radar, enemy radars. So we did a lot of low-level flying to avoid the radar. That was demanding. We did some of that at night in bad weather. So in this aeroplane, that was demanding. We never went anywhere as a single ship, basically. It was always in a formation of at least 2, mostly 4 ships. And always around 480 knots speed over the ground. So high speed, highly manoeuvrable, and always in combination with other aeroplanes. So that in itself is just demanding, trying to coordinate those aeroplanes and arrive on target, on time. You know, we had limits on our time on target of plus or minus 15 seconds. So fairly demanding mentally. And I guess that was what was so good about the aeroplane, just the challenge of pulling all that together and coming away from a mission feeling, well, I've achieved it and I've done it very well. So it was fantastic. It was both a mental challenge and a physical challenge. Because this one is delta wing, it had extremely sensitive roll stability, if you like. It's not quite the right term, but it would roll rapidly, and it had no real ability to return to wings level. So that was one of the challenges when you're operating at night in weather. You could wind up upside down without realising you've rolled upside down. It would roll at about 360 to 420 degrees per second, so to give you an idea of how delicate it was in roll. Whereas the F-18 being a more straight wing aeroplane, it only rolled about 180 degrees per second, and it had some good dihedral stability and some good roll stability, so it would actually hold wings level without you thinking about it, without you actually making it hold wings level. So that was one of the big differences. But the other big difference between the two aeroplanes was the F-18 had good systems. It had good radios, had plenty of fuel, had two good engines, and it could do the job comfortably. So to a large extent, it was much more of a carefree aeroplane than the Mirage. The F-18 also had a navigation system, so you knew where you were. So you knew how much fuel how much excess fuel you had to go and do the job. Whereas the Mirage didn't have a navigation system as such, so everything was dead reckoning. So there was a lot of mental gymnastics to try and calculate how far away you are from a landing field, how much fuel I got left, how much fuel am I burning, and you're doing those mental gymnastics the whole time in a flight with this thing. And we used to carry big tanks under the wings. We could carry 3 of them, and the aeroplane would go for 4 hours with those tanks on. So, and other times you carry no fuel tanks, just a clean aeroplane, it would last for about 25 minutes. So quite a big difference. Whereas the F-18, with internal fuel, would go for 2 hours. The other thing with this radar, we used to do stuff low level, looking for targets low level with the radar, and being an old analog type radar, the ground clutter would cloud out your radar image. So we spent a lot of time with the radar control stick, manipulating the antenna elevation to try and break out the targets in the side lobes, the radar side lobes. So you can imagine flying around at night at 1,000 feet at 600 knots, trying to work the radar, head down the bucket, working the radar and the antenna elevation, trying to break out a Canberra target or another Mirage or an F-111 in the side lobes. A lot of risk and a lot of effort, just staying alive, basically. It was a challenge, as I said. That was the beauty of the aeroplane. That's probably why we all loved it. It was just a big challenge. The tank here, if you could turn the camera around, that's what's called an RPK-10. It's a supersonic tank, so it's good for Mach 1.9. But it also carries 4 500-pound bombs. You can see the weapon stations on the side of it. So that gave the aeroplane quite a good load. With those 2 tanks like that and a centerline tank, you go probably a range or a radius of about 400 miles, nautical miles, so 800 kilometres. You carry 10 weapons, which is not a bad load for an old delta wing aeroplane. Yeah. The way aeroplanes measure airspeed is through what they call a pitot tube. As you can imagine, when you're flying through the air impacts in the tube here through the orifice in the nose. And so what we're doing in airspeed measurement is measuring the actual pressure of the air that's being felt by a sensor in this tube. The trouble is, as we go in altitude, the static pressure around us changes. As you know, down at sea level, it's 14 pounds per square inch, or 10-13 millibars. Up at 40,000 feet, it's only half that. So we've also got to measure the static pressure, that is the outside air pressure. And that's what these little ports here do, because they're in stagnation points on this shape, and they just measure the static pressure. So you take this here measures the dynamic pressure plus the static pressure. You then measure the static pressure, take it away, that leaves your dynamic pressure, which is your airspeed. I mentioned that Mirage has a complex intake. As you get past about Mach 1.2, this little cone here moves forward. The idea is it creates a shock wave on the tip, and it's the idea that as you go faster, the shock wave goes more oblique, and you want to keep the shock wave out of the intake. A little aerodynamic knowledge is all the air behind a shock wave is subsonic, and these early engines couldn't handle supersonic air. So we had to keep the air going down the intake subsonic. So that's what that does. And not only that, see, it gets bigger, it closes down the intake as well. So that reduces the amount of air going through the engine, reduces the drag, therefore you can go faster. And that's all it is. It's not to do with thrust or anything, it's just simply the intake design. Same on the Concorde, same on the F-11. One of the older beasts of the Air Force did a real job. It was actually bought to as a deterrent against what we thought was the communist threat moving down through Vietnam, through Indonesia, onto our border. So it was designed to fly low level at night in bad weather, and that's why it's actually called its nickname is the aardvark, or groundhog, because it used to fly down 100 feet, very high speed, and using this terrain following radar to avoid the terrain, basically. I've never flown the aeroplane. I've flown in it 2 or 3 times. I've been out to Mach 2.5 in it, and I've done some TFRing in what they call hard ride. It had 2 different modes, soft and hard ride, in the terrain following radar flight control system. And in hard ride, it flies down 100 feet, and it waits to the last moment before it pitches to avoid the hills. And that's quite daunting when you're a novice. And it would have taken the guys some time to become comfortable with doing that, especially at night or in weather. The time I did it was daylight, nice visual day, but you'd run up to a ridge line. This is out of South Australia with some continuous ridges. You'd run up to a ridge line and you'd be thinking, I'd be pulling up now, and it'd keep pressing for another probably 10 seconds or more, 15 seconds. Then it would pitch. And then before I got to the top of the ridge, you'd be pitching over the top, and you'd be pointing at the hill, and then it'd go down the other side into a valley, and then it'd start pitching at the bottom. And again, this whole time until you got used to it, it was just always leaving things way beyond where you'd normally actually manipulate the aeroplane. So that was exciting. Going to Mach 2.5, going to high Mach numbers is a bit of an exercise, academic exercise to some extent. In the aeroplane, you don't notice anything. The flight control systems are designed to take care of all the aerodynamic forces that happen. And but occasionally, I know in the Mirage, I once saw the shockwave outside the window, outside the canopy, and that just depends on atmospheric conditions. You can actually see the condensation in the actual line of shock. So that's quite interesting. The other thing about these aeroplanes, this one can't get particularly high. Unless it can't get above about 30,000 feet unless it's supersonic. So that was one of the issues with the dump and burn characteristic that they used at air shows all the time in Australia. Never used it overseas or in America. The reason for that was they were worried about having an engine failure at altitude and having to continue to cruise at altitude and having to use the afterburner on the other engine to keep the aeroplane flying at that altitude, and at the same time dumping fuel to get their weight down to land. So they were worried about aeroplane running an afterburner with fuel dumping out the back. And there's a story in the latest Wings magazine that explains how they went about, why that came about. And as an Australian test pilot, I actually did that flying for the US to demonstrate that it worked okay. So yeah, that's where the dump and burn came from. And we just adopted it for our display routine. And it was very spectacular, as you know. The aeroplane is very capable. It can carry a lot of weapons. In the later years, in fact, Australia was quite early with laser-guided bomb technology, and I did a lot of flight test work with the F-111, clearing laser-guided bombs from the various stations on the aeroplane. All that work was done at Woomera. My role was basically to design the project, design the flight test routine, and then fly the chase, the photo chase in a Mirage. One of those chase missions, we had a big laser-guided bomb on this aeroplane, a 2,000 pounder, and they wanted it cleared to 635 knots in a 4.5 G pitch at 45 degrees nose up. So to get to that condition, we ran the aeroplane out in TFR mode to 730 knots at 100 feet, and then pitched to the I was in the Mirage flying chase, photo chase, and I was actually surfing on the bow wave of the F-111, literally surfing. I had about 10 degrees of bank, hold position, I could slide up and down the face of the wave. It was quite exciting. Only lasted for about 40 seconds, but still I was able to, I'm the only man in the world, I guess, who's been surfing at Mach 1.3 at 100 feet. We got to my second favourite aeroplane, the FA-18. Again, this one is a true multi-role fighter aircraft. We didn't have to make it work in the multi-role modes as we do with the Mirage, but it came with all that capability built in, so it's an impressive little aeroplane. Not so little, as you can see, but I was fortunate enough to do most of the first flights out of the factory when we assembled it down at Avalon. The routine was bought under a foreign military sales program, and the aeroplane belonged to the US Navy until it was delivered to Williamtown or Tyndall and accepted by the RAF. So the process they used in the US was the contractor, McDonnell Douglas, would fly the aeroplane for 2 or 3 times to make sure the product was built correctly. And then the Navy, US Navy, would then fly it for a similar 2 or 3 flights to accept it, make sure it was acceptable. So we followed that routine down at Avalon. I was assigned as the McDonnell Douglas pilot. So I did the first couple of flights for half the program, and then Brian Robinson took my role and he carried on from there, and I went across to become the acceptance test pilot. So I worked for the US Navy for the last half of the program and accepted the aeroplanes into service. So the actual test flying was pretty straightforward flying. We'd do a couple of flight control checks at 10,000 feet, then climb to the National Tropopause, 36,000 feet, and take it out to a maximum Mach number, which was only Mach 1.6, 1.7. And that was because the intake is a simple intake, whereas the Mirage had a complex intake. It could go to Mach 2.5. This one would stop at about 1.6 because the intake would choke and build up a huge wave of air in front of it. And so you didn't have enough thrust to push through that drag. Yeah. So that's the only reason it wouldn't go faster. Obviously, when they designed the aeroplane, they decided, probably out of Vietnam experience and a few other skirmishes around the world, they didn't need the extra high speed. They've taken that time-space domain out with weapons. So these days they carry weapons that can actually travel further distances and at high speed. So that's how they've compromised in that regard. And this aeroplane was designed more for manoeuvre than it was for high speed. So delightful aeroplane to fly, very easy to fly. It's fly-by-wire, of course, so and it's what the pilot does in cockpit, he manoeuvres the stick or the rudders to command a particular rate of change in one of the axes, or the pitch, roll, or yaw, and then the flight control computers manoeuvre the control surfaces to achieve that command. So that's how it works, and so it's very predictable, very reliable, and quite manoeuvrable as a result of that. Because it was designed as a digital aeroplane, can carry a whole range of weapons, both anti-surface weapons, anti-shipping weapons, air-to-air weapons, and they can be integrated relatively simply through software coding. The only hard part then is the actual physical attachment onto the aeroplane, but in the design stage they did a lot of work designing the underwing pylons and the pylon shape and capabilities themselves. So the F-18 served us for a long time. I first flew the aeroplane in 1984. So I went across to the first cadre of instructors and did my training on the aeroplane. And at that stage, our first two-seaters were both at Patuxent River. they've been accepted at St. Louis out of the factory in McDonnell Douglas and flown to Patuxent River on the East Coast. And I went across to actually, for continuation training and to certify or qualify a few Australian unique modifications on the aeroplane. And the other aeroplane was used primarily by the first instructors to just for continuation training, get themselves some experience, and also to work out how much oil the thing had and how much oxy it had for the ferry home, because they'd been instructed to ferry them home in one long leg. So with lots of air refueling. So that's what they did over there at Patuxent River. We just trained air refueling, worked out how much oil the thing was burning, how much oxy it was burning, things like that. Towards the end, obviously we exercised this aeroplane. It's the first time a RAF fighter has been used in anger in the Middle East on a couple of exercises there. It did very well, I gather. I wasn't involved, of course, but I think all the crews that went across with it were very, very happy with the way the aeroplane stood up and the role it played over there. Ultimately, as with all these machines, I think, as I said, we got it in 1984, or slightly earlier, and it lasted till, 4 years ago, 2018. So that's about 40 years, 36 years, something like that. It's a long time for an aeroplane of this caliber to stay in service. So I think just that alone is enough to say it's now becoming a little bit redundant in terms of the systems on board and the maintenance. Again, it's a maintenance cost. You just can't keep replacing those bits of kit because they all get superseded and they're no longer manufactured. So it becomes a very costly exercise. So like all this machinery, it's got to be replaced, unfortunately. So we decided to join a consortium, an international consortium, to help fund development of the F-35. Originally, it wasn't the F-35 alone. There was a couple of aeroplanes that were flying off against each other, and the F-35 was the winner. And once we got involved in that, that's what we purchased. The Super Hornet was purchased. It's a big aeroplane than this one. It's about 1/3 the size again. And it was purchased mainly to replace the F-111. It was actually acquired for a strike function, but it's actually used in the air defence role as well because it's still quite capable air defence wise. So we got a pretty good fleet, I think, with the F-35, the combination of the F-35 and the Super Hornet. Probably don't have quite the strike role or strike capability we had with the F-111, but then again, our posture more is defensive anyway. So having an aggressive strike capability is probably not inside our national policy. So I mentioned that this aeroplane is limited to Mach 1.7. As you can see, it's just got a simple pitot intake. So there's no mice, no cone. All it's got is this, what's called a splitter plate. And so the shockwave forms on here, and at Mach 1.7 or thereabouts, it's just the oblique shockwave is sitting just outside the intake here. So once again, all the air going down the intake is subsonic. This little porous panel here takes the boundary layer air, which goes down here. A lot of it's ejected overboard above the wing, and a lot of it is exhausted through here as well, just to take care of the pressure changes. So that's how our simple intake works, and that's why this aeroplane can't go faster than Mach 1.7. But it has 4 hard points out on the wing. There's 2 outboard here on the folding panel as well, and those 2 there. And they can carry a multitude of weapons. These are a bit limited in the mass they could carry, just because of strength.
Right.
And then it's got the tip carriers for missiles, for the heat-seeking missiles. And it's got chin stations on the sides of the intake for radar missiles. I don't know if you can see those there. Yeah, see just there beside the undercarriage?
Yeah.
That's where the Sparrow missiles go. Okay. And as you can see here, this is a vertical ejector rack. It can carry 2 1,000-pounders. So the US Navy, because they use 1,000-pound bombs, and that's because that's the most explosive effect in the space they have available in their storage on a carrier. That's whereas a 500-pounder takes up almost similar space, but doesn't have the same explosive effect. So they compromise with a 1,000-pounder. I like the 2,000-pounder. It does real damage. It's a massive weapon. The laser-guided bomb is about 18 feet long. So what's that? 6 meters in length. So it's a bloody big weapon. And we can carry 4 of those on these stations. Yeah. This is a fuel tank, 330 gallon fuel tank. Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
And on the centerline pylon there, you see that's a forward-looking infrared tracker sensor and laser tracker. So that's what it does. So if you're carrying laser-guided bombs, you can see the target through your screens in the cockpit, and the laser stays pointing at the target until the impact.
Even though you've only got a few short spurts on it.
Yeah. Well, as I said, this one's a 20mm cannon. Doesn't look that big there, but they're quite a significant round as well. It can fire at either 4,000 rounds a minute or 6,000 rounds a minute. Typically, for training, they'll send them on 4,000 rounds a minute just to save a few rounds and give you a bit more time of practice. But the actual drum only carries, as I said, 578 rounds. So you do that at 6,000 rounds a minute, you got, what's that, 10 seconds worth of firing? Or less, 6 seconds. But that's a long time. In flight, that's a long, long time. I've tried with the Mirage, in a steep dive, strafing, you just can't, you don't really have the time to fire out a full gun pack. It's just, you're burning up so much vertical space, that even that little time, you don't have time. The other thing I should point out, this is the pitot tube on the Hornet. So there's one on both sides for redundancy. And this is the tube that brought down that Air France aeroplane out of Brazil or Argentina, wherever it came from, because they iced up. So these things are heated, and if you leave the heater on after you land, it burns the troops' hands, and they'll melt these things when they put them on. And this one here is an angle attack vane. I won't take it off, but this measures the angle that the aeroplane is making with the oncoming airflow. So it's just a vane that works, that follows the airflow. And this aeroplane can fly at 30 degrees angle of attack, so say level flight at 30. So it's pretty impressive. There's an issue with air refueling. Around the other side is the air refueling probe. It's retractable. You can't actually see it, but it comes out, you can see that panel there. It comes out at an angle from there. And when you're refueling, of course, the first time I ever refueled was the most unnatural thing you ever do is bump into something in the sky. and it's quite a delicate maneuver because the basket's only about that round and it's made of metal. It looks like it's made of feathers, but it's not. So it's quite solid and quite hard. And what it does as you move in, the bow wave off your nose pushes it up and away to the right. So as you move in to engage, and you've got to keep a forward speed going, otherwise you won't engage. And as you move in, you've got a judicious bit of rudder, right rudder, a little bit of back stick, a little bit of left roll, and then put it in the basket. and then on the actual take-up reel, the reel that the hose is on, it's got a spring mechanism which winds back all the overtake slack. And if it doesn't work, you wonder where the big snake goes up the hose, and it just gets bigger as it comes back, and it rips the probe off. And I've had that happen to me. So, and also the other thing is, if you miss it, you lip the jolly basket. In other words, your probe hits it on the edge. You'll go past it, then it'll fold around the cockpit. It'll wrap itself around the aeroplane, take these probes off, and smash the canopy. I've taken a probe off, taken one of these off. And we do that in night, in weather, clouds, so it's quite exciting at times. These, I'm not sure what these are, but on the nose there is a modern fuse. I've never used one of those fuses, so I don't know what it is. And that's all, but that's a 500-pound bomb. Or they call it a 500-pound GP, general purpose bomb. We generally train, we don't train with high explosive bombs. That's not quite true. We tend to train with high explosive substitute bombs. So they've got only 40 kilograms of high explosive and the rest of the fuel is a substitute of some sort. So we don't actually use war stock high explosive weapons in training typically. So when you see one of those go off in a demonstration, it's not quite the effect of a real one. So, yeah. This is just a training setup, carries 6 little practice bombs, and they're designed to have the similar trajectory of these things. So the sighting or the manoeuvring to achieve a weapon solution is the same with those as it is in one of those. The other thing I should say, in the Second World War, when you watch all those bombing movies, the bombs are free fall. They're clamped in the bomb racks and just released, and they free fall under gravity. Modern aeroplanes, once you get above about 250 knots, the airflow around the airfield, around the aircraft is so strong that you actually got to explosively jettison the bombs. So in these racks here, you just see a piston in the middle of that one there. That's the ejector foot. The hooks are retracted pyrotechnically with explosives, and then the actual explosives then push those ejector feet out and get the bomb away from the aeroplane.
After a lunch break, Ron took us over to the second hangar, where we were introduced to the early jets used by the RAAF.
In front of us here today, we've got the Meteor, and behind you we'll talk about shortly is the Sabre. The Meteor preceded the Sabre, which preceded the Mirage, which preceded the Hornet. So that was a sequence of fighter aircraft the RAF owned or operated in the jet era. I should say they did own the Vampire a little bit earlier, and it was used in a fighter role as well, although not very successful as a fighter. The Meteor took over from the Mustang in Korea during the Korean War, and it was used quite successfully in the ground attack role. Again, it was an attempt to be a multi-role machine for the RAF. I don't know that it was that effective as a fighter in air combat roles. One of its limitations, I suspect, and I don't know from first-hand experience, was the engine. People recall that all modern jet engines tend to be what they call an axial flow engine. In other words, the airflow flows straight through a set of fan blades or compressor blades into a set of turbine blades after combusting the fuel. But with this, with the Meteor and the Vampire, they had what was called a centrifugal flow engine. So it had, in the front of the engine, had a big water pump type impeller, and that used to diffuse the air out to the edges at high speed, then into the compressor stages. That had limitations on its agility in a combat role. You couldn't accelerate the engine quickly, so you had some constraints on how you managed the aeroplane because the engine handling was difficult, basically. Other than that, they both had 30mm cannons, so they were a good weapon for air-to-surface type strafing operations. The Sabre was very manoeuvrable, so it was quite a good day-to-day or daylight fighter. It didn't have much of a capability in weather or at night, although I think later versions had a small radar in the nose, which was there for helping finesse the gun solution on a target. I think they used rockets a lot on both aeroplanes. To my mind, rockets aren't a particularly useful weapon because they're so subject to your pitch attitude, and if you're not pointing stably in the right direction, the rocket will go all over the place. Most fighter aircraft have a speed brake, and again, it's a flight control to try and aid agility. There are times when you need to slow down quickly, so in that case you close all the throttles, of course, and pop the speed brakes out, and that'll help you actually slow down. It may help you avoid an aggressor, it may not, but that's what they are for, basically. And on the Sabre, as you can see, it's got this one's quite a prominent speed brake down the back of the aeroplane, so it doesn't hurt the flow of the over the main plane of the aeroplane, so it doesn't affect your aerodynamic handling as such. On the Mirage, it had plates on the upper and lower surface of the wing. They are quite small, but they are very, very effective. And yeah, you go from 600 knots back to 200 knots in about 15 seconds. They did have some value in certain situations. Pilots love flying the Sabre, and there's still a few flying. The guys who fly them still thoroughly enjoy the aeroplane. So it is a pilot's aeroplane. Not sure about the Meteor, although we've got one flying out of with 100 Squadron down at Temora, and I haven't had a chance to speak to the guy who flies it, but I suspect he quite enjoys the challenge anyway. Of flying an old machine like that requires a bit of delicate handling.
At the end of the day, we all had a go at flying the FA-18 simulator. Our landing abilities were pitted against those of former test pilot Ron. Not a fair competition if you ask me, but a lot of fun in a realistic simulation. There were also a few cockpits in which we could try on for size, and accompanied by the sound of F-35s rocketing overhead. It was quite the day for enthusiasts like ourselves. We would like to extend a big thank you to Ron, the guides and manager at Fighter World, for making our visit so memorable.